13-year-old Shannon Capers lived a quiet life on the fringes of town, just 3 miles from the Arkansas border. Her neighborhood was the kind where everyone knew one another, and the sight of Shannon walking through the streets on her way to junior high was a familiar one. But on March 8, 1997, a routine day turned into a nightmare. Shannon had left home that morning, heading for the small town she and her family called home. She would never return. By early evening, as the sunlight began to fade, her family grew uneasy. They began calling neighbors, friends, anyone who might have seen Shannon. But as dusk settled over the neighborhood, worry turned into panic. Unable to locate their daughter and fearing the worst, the Capers family contacted local police. Detective Ben Booth, a juvenile investigator with years of experience handling missing persons cases, received the call. The situation wasn't unusual. Teens sometimes wandered off, lost track of time, or sought solitude, but something about this report felt different. Booth immediately started digging for answers. Shannon Capers was a student at the local junior high, a place where her kind and bubbly personality had earned her plenty of friends. But despite Booth's exhaustive interviews with her classmates, none had any information about her whereabouts. Shannon had simply vanished. Days turned into weeks, and as hope began to wane, Booth expanded the search. He contacted the local news media, sharing Shannon's photograph and pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Her name was entered into the National Crime Information Center database, but no credible leads materialized. By spring of 1999, 2 years after Shannon's disappearance, the investigation had gone cold. Then, on May 5, 1999, a startling breakthrough emerged. Detective Chris Smith was sitting at his desk when the phone rang. On the other end of the line was a woman with a chilling story. She claimed to know what had happened to Shannon Capers and where to find her body. The anonymous caller provided specific details. Shannon was buried in the woods behind the apartment complex where she'd lived. Even more disturbingly, the woman implicated a local man, Morris Tate, as the one responsible for the young girl's death. Smith pressed for more information. "How do you know this?" he asked. "Can I call you back?" But the caller, seemingly wary of being traced, abruptly hung up. Despite the cryptic nature of the tip, the details were too specific to ignore. A team was assembled to comb through the dense 10-acre forest behind the Capers apartment complex. They searched tirelessly, but as night fell, their efforts yielded nothing. Frustrated and defeated, the team called off the search. 2 days later, the anonymous caller phoned again. This time, her tone was more insistent. "You didn't look hard enough," she said. "The body is there. Go back." The second call reignited the investigation. Once again, officers gathered to search the area, now guided by the woman's more precise instructions. Detective Booth, who had overseen the initial investigation into Shannon's disappearance, joined the effort. Hours passed with no success. Then, as the search grid shifted slightly, an officer noticed something unusual. A cigar, discarded casually by the police chief, had landed near a small patch of scrub. Beneath it, partially hidden by leaves and debris, lay a human skull. Detective Booth recalled the moment with clarity. The chief looked at me, and I looked at him. It was unmistakable. The remains were carefully unearthed and transported to the state forensics lab for analysis. DNA testing confirmed the grim discovery. The body was indeed that of Shannon Capers. Her 2-year disappearance had officially turned into a homicide investigation. Shannon's remains told a horrific story. Forensic examination revealed a bullet hole in her skull, a chilling testament to the violence she had endured. Detectives now faced the daunting task of solving her murder, relying only on the few pieces of evidence they had and the mysterious voice on the phone. The anonymous tipster, who had guided investigators to Shannon's body, had also implicated Morris Tate. Tate, a local drug dealer, was well known to authorities. But what connection could he possibly have to a 13-year-old girl? And why would someone kill her? Detectives began to dig into Tate's life, focusing on his relationships and acquaintances. The trail led them to Charnice McKnight, a former girlfriend of Tate's who had reported him to a local hospital for domestic abuse. McKnight had suffered broken bones, black eyes, and countless bruises at Tate's hands, and she had every reason to speak out against him. Detectives flew to San Antonio, Texas, where McKnight was now living, in hopes that she might shed light on the case. At first, McKnight was wary of the implications of her cooperation, but as the interview wore on, she broke down in tears and confessed to being the anonymous caller. McKnight admitted that Tate had confided in her shortly after Shannon's disappearance. He had told her that he killed the young girl, claiming she was pregnant with his child. It was a revelation that had haunted McKnight for years, but her fear of Tate's violent temper kept her silent until now. She gave chilling details of the crime, saying that Tate had taken Shannon into the woods and choked and shot her, afterward burying her body in a shallow grave. Her account fitted the evidence found at the scene, but the detectives knew they needed more in order to have something concrete on Tate. Police arrested Tate and brought him in for questioning. Despite hours of interrogation, he maintained his innocence, offering a flimsy alibi that placed him nowhere near the crime scene. Detectives were unfazed. Tate's attempts to explain away his involvement only made him appear more suspicious. In one particularly telling moment, he mentioned details only the killer would know. The case went to trial, where prosecutors presented a compelling narrative supported by forensic evidence and McKnight's testimony. After 4 days of testimony, the jury returned a verdict in less than 30 minutes, guilty of second-degree murder. Tate was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To Shannon's family, the verdict brought some sort of closure. After years of questions with no answer, they finally knew what had happened to their daughter and who was responsible. Though the pain of their loss would never fully fade, they took comfort in knowing justice had been served. Morris Tate's conviction marked the end of a long and painful chapter for the Caper family, but the story of Shannon's tragic death continued to haunt those who had worked the case. For Detective Ben Booth, the discovery of Shannon's remains was bittersweet. It was the moment they had hoped for, but dreaded in equal measure. Shannon had been found, but the innocence of her youth and the life she should have lived were gone forever. The trial revealed disturbing details about Tate's motives and behavior. Testimony from Charnice McKnight painted a picture of a man whose violent tendencies and disregard for others had spiraled out of control. She described his anger when he learned that Shannon might be carrying his child, an unthinkable situation given her young age. To Tate, the pregnancy was a threat, to his reputation, to his lifestyle, and perhaps to his freedom. His solution was as cold as it was cruel. The prosecution had built its case piece by piece. Forensic evidence included a bullet hole through Shannon's skull, confirming the manner of death described by McKnight. Expert testimony pointed out that the bullet's trajectory also would have corresponded with Shannon's body in that grave, and again implicated Tate at the crime scene. The DNA evidence presented at trial, while limited due to the state of technology, placed Shannon at the location described by McKnight. The defense attempted to discredit McKnight, painting her as a scorned lover seeking revenge against Tate. But her testimony, combined with the physical evidence, was too compelling to ignore. Prosecutors highlighted her courage in coming forward despite the years of abuse she endured at Tate's hands. "It's not easy to speak out against someone who has hurt you," the prosecutor argued in closing statements. But Charnice McKnight did so because Shannon Capers deserved justice. The jury's swift decision reflected the strength of the case. For Shannon's parents, the verdict was a moment of both relief and sorrow. "We're glad he's behind bars," her father said outside the courthouse, "but it doesn't bring our little girl back. Nothing ever will." In the months following the trial, Shannon's family worked to honor her memory. They established a scholarship fund in her name, dedicated to helping local students pursue their dreams. Shannon loved to learn, her mother shared during a local news interview. "This is our way of keeping her spirit alive." The case also brought renewed attention to the issue of domestic violence and its ripple effects. McKnight's story resonated with many, particularly women who had suffered in silence. Local organizations used the case as a platform to advocate for stronger protections for abuse victims and more robust resources for those seeking help. Sharnice's bravery helped solve a murder, one advocate noted, but it also shone a light on the consequences of ignoring abuse. We can't let that happen again. For law enforcement, the resolution of Shannon's case served as a reminder of the power of persistence. Detectives Booth and Smith reflected on the challenges they faced, from the initial lack of leads to the painstaking searches in the woods. "It's easy to lose hope when a case goes cold," Booth admitted, "but you never really stop looking. You never stop caring." The anonymous phone calls were another pivotal element of the investigation. Without them, Shannon's body might have never been found. Police later speculated about McKnight's motivations for making the calls. Some believed she was driven by guilt over her silence, while others saw it as an act of defiance against Tate. Whatever her reasons, her decision to come forward was the turning point in the case. As for Tate, his life sentence ensured he would never harm another young girl. In prison, he remained defiant, refusing to admit his guilt or show remorse for his actions. But his protests fell on deaf ears. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the verdict was final. Shannon Caper's story is one of heartbreak, resilience, and justice. It's a story of a young girl whose life was stolen, but whose memory inspired change. It's a story of a family's unwavering determination to find answers, and of a community coming together to demand accountability. And it's a story of how even the smallest voices, like that of an anonymous caller, can make the biggest difference. The wooded area where Shannon's remains were discovered has since been cleared, a bittersweet transformation for those who remember the search. "It's hard to go back there," Detective Smith confessed in an interview years later. "Every time I do, I see her face. But I also see the faces of her family, and I remind myself why we do what we do." For the Capers family, life after Shannon has been a journey of healing. They continue to share her story, hoping it will serve as a cautionary tale and a source of strength for others. "Shannon was taken from us too soon," her mother said at a community event. "But her legacy will live on, in the lives she's touched and the lessons we've learned." For those who loved Shannon Capers, the passage of time has done little to dull the ache of her loss. Yet her story stands as a beacon, a reminder of the importance of perseverance in the face of despair, the courage it takes to speak the truth, and the power of a community united in the pursuit of justice. Detective Ben Booth, reflecting on the case years later, described it as one that changed him forever. "Shannon was just a kid," he said. "She had her whole life ahead of her. When we found her, it wasn't just about solving a case, it was about giving her family the answers they deserved. It was about making sure she wasn't forgotten." For Shannon's family, each passing day is both a reminder of her absence and a testament to the resilience she inspired. She was kind, she was full of life, and she loved deeply. Her mother shared during a candlelight vigil held in Shannon's honor. If her story can help protect even one child, then her life wasn't in vain. Sharnice McKnight's courage in coming forward was a turning point in the case, but it also sparked conversations about accountability and the need to support survivors of abuse. Her decision to break her silence, despite the personal risk, transformed her into an unlikely hero. "I didn't speak up for years," she admitted, "but when I did, I knew it was for Shannon and for myself. It was time to end the fear." Today, Shannon Caper's legacy lives on not only in the memories of her loved ones, but also in the actions taken to prevent such tragedies from happening again. A small plaque dedicated to her stands in the local park where she once played, a simple but poignant reminder of the life that was stolen too soon. Below her name are the words her family chose to represent her enduring impact. Gone, but never forgotten. In the end, Shannon's story is not just about loss, it's about resilience, justice, and the enduring strength of love. Though the woods behind her apartment held dark secrets for years, they ultimately gave up their silence, revealing the truth that had eluded everyone for so long. And in that truth, the Capers family found the peace they had sought for so many years. Shannon Capers will never walk those streets of Arkansas anymore, but her name will only continue to resound within the halls of justice, within the hearts of her family members, and amongst memories of individuals who never let her story go obsolete. And it's that one way in which her voice yet speaks, reminding us all the need always to listen and to care where and when it matters most. Anna Mae Florence was a quiet, kind-hearted woman who lived her life with love and generosity. She adored her family, especially her sister Lily and brother-in-law Alonzo, who often came by for visits or to take her out on errands. What started, like most mornings, with Anna Mae fixing up for a day of shopping with Lily and Alonzo, proved to be her last day alive. The simple things had always defined Anna Mae's life, telling stories to the neighbors, baking for church functions, and making sure that everyone around her felt cared for. Her home, a modest apartment filled with photographs of her family in hand-knit throws, was a reflection of her own warmth. This morning, the faint scent of lavender still lingered in the air, a reminder of the perfume she always wore on special outings. She hummed softly to herself, oblivious to the danger lurking just beyond her door. Morning dawned as mornings do. Anna Mae sat near her window, ready and waiting. Shopping days with Lily were her favorite, browsing stores downtown, sharing a meal, and talking about family. She smiled to herself, imagining the day ahead. The soft sunlight streamed through her curtains, illuminating her favorite armchair, in which she sat patiently. Outside, the neighborhood bustled with its routine noises, children laughing, a dog somewhere in the distance barking, the far-off hum of passing cars. Anna Mae checked her watch and tittered. "They're late again," she thought, fondly shaking her head. There was an optimism about today, the sense that what awaited her on this afternoon was something other than running errands, rather, time spent with the people who mattered most to her. When Lily and Alonzo arrived at Anna Mae's apartment, a feeling of great eeriness surrounded them. Usually, Anna Mae would greet them with a bright smile and an open door. Now, there was only silence. They called out her name. "Anna Mae?" "It's us," Lily called, her voice growing louder with each unanswered knock. Alonzo stepped closer, pressing his ear to the door. The silence inside felt heavy, oppressive even, like the calm before a storm. "Something's not right," he muttered, his brow furrowing with concern. Lily clutched her purse tightly at her side as dread crept into her chest. The stillness was deafening, every second unbearably. Then they heard it, a scream. It wasn't a startled cry, but terror in its most pure and chilling form. The piercing scream froze them in place as they heard her desperate voice inside the apartment. The scream rattled along the hall from floor to floor and reverberated off the walls. It was so raw and guttural, it seemed almost like time itself stopped for that moment in time. Lily's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "Anna Mae!" she gasped, her voice shaking. Alonzo's heart was racing in his chest, the veins coursing with adrenaline. The seconds dragged on, each one soaked in terror and apprehension. Then, faintly, they heard it again, a desperate cry for help. "Kick the door in!" Lily yelled, her voice cracking under the weight of panic. The door flung open of its own accord, and out came a woman, barreling. Wild-eyed and in a panic, she was covered in blood. Crimson streaks ran down her hands, stained her clothes, and smeared her face. A sight to see, indeed, one that would stick in the minds of Alonzo and Lily forever. Her breath coming in ragged gasps, the woman flung herself into the hallway, smearing streaks of blood along the doorframe. Her eyes darted round wildly, like those of a cornered animal, terrified, with something darker mixed with the fear. Guilt, maybe? Lily went backwards, clutching at Alonzo's arm as if her knees would buckle. "Who is she?" The whisper was so low that hardly even Lily could hear it. The stranger sprints wildly. With every movement, with each pace, mystery met bloody chaos unknowingly. Alonzo made one hesitating step forward as terror battled his instincts. Now, Alonzo turned towards the apartment where his heart was racing in his chest. The most horrifying view greeted him upon entry. Anna May lying on the floor, her body crumpled and lifeless with blood gathering around her as it seeped into the carpet, a cord tightly wrapped around her neck, with bruises to the face and arms. The room was a tableau of violence. Broken furniture, scattered belongings, and the metallic scent of blood hung thick in the air. Alonzo's breath caught in his throat as he fell to his knees beside Anna May. "No, no, no," he whispered, his voice breaking with anguish. Lily stood frozen in the doorway, her face ashen, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The sight of Anna May, the anchor who had always been there, reduced to this state, was a cruel, inconceivable nightmare. She was alive, but barely. Her eyes flickered open and she tried to speak. Her voice was barely audible, as if it came from a great distance in broken bits. Her lips barely moved, and the words, if words they were, came out in a whisper, fragile as glass. "I tried," she murmured, her breath catching with each syllable. Tears streaming down his face, Alonzo leaned closer, trying to catch every word. "Tried to what, Anna May? Who did this to you?" He begged, his voice shaking. Her eyes, with pain and waning light, latched onto his for one quick second. "Forgive her," she whispered, barely audible before her strength gave out. "The paramedics have arrived, but it was beyond their help by then." Gone was Anna May Florence, soft-spoken, kind, full of love and warmth. And outside, the flashing red and blue lights cast weird shadows on the apartment's walls. More paramedics run in with equipment until their faces cannot hide the evident grimness of the whole scene. Alonzo and Lily were gently ushered aside, though neither could tear their eyes away from Anna May's still form. "She's gone," one of the paramedics whispered to his colleague, shaking his head. Lily collapsed into Alonzo's arms, her sobs filling the void left by the silence of Anna May's absence. It was one of those moments that seemed surreal, but was so real, a tragedy that left them utterly broken. The detectives who arrived at the scene were seasoned, but even they were shocked by the brutality of Anna May's murder. She had been beaten, stabbed, and strangled. It was senseless and infuriating. Detectives Kathy Justice and Ralph Taylor exchanged a glance as they took in the scene, their faces grim but determined. This wasn't just murder, it was rage, Kathy muttered under her breath, observing the extent of the injuries. Ralph nodded, his jaw clenched as he turned to the bloody cord lying on the floor. "Someone wanted to make sure she didn't survive," he replied, weighty anger laced in every word. The weight of responsibility pressed upon them to document each shred of evidence with due diligence. They knew they owed it to Anna May and her family to solve this case, no matter how many years might go by. But amidst that mess of mayhem, there was that one clue, that bloody fingerprint on the wall just above the spot where Anna May went down. Kathy squatted down, a weak print smudged on the wall lighting up under her flashlight. "It's faint, but it's something," she said, reaching for an evidence marker. Ralph bent down further, squinting at the print as if to will it to give up its secrets. "If this belongs to the killer, it could break the case wide open," he said, hope threading his tone. The fingerprint was carefully photographed and preserved, each step deliberate and methodical. This fragile thread in a host of tangles was enough to set burning the determination in both of them to bring the perpetrators of this heinous crime before the courts. Neighbors testified to having seen a young woman in the area that day. She was nicely dressed, had a purse, and was going door to door asking for money. One neighbor recalled that she said it was for a funeral. She seemed harmless enough, one elderly neighbor told the detectives, clutching her teacup nervously. Said she needed money to bury a loved one. "I didn't think twice about it." Another neighbor remembered something more chilling. She had this strange look in her eyes like she was desperate. "I thought it was grief, but now I'm not so sure that," he admitted, glancing nervously at the detective's notepads. Piece by piece, the detectives began reconstructing the woman's movements. But without a name or a solid lead, it felt like chasing a shadow. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. The case went cold, but it was never forgotten. Anna Mae's family clung to hope, their lives forever marked by the unanswered questions. Lily often found herself staring at Anna Mae's photograph, wondering if justice would ever come. The detectives, too, couldn't let it go. Kathy retired years later, but she kept a file on Anna Mae's case in her home office, reopening it on sleepless nights. "We'll find you," she whispered to the nameless killer, a silent promise she refused to break. For almost 3 decades, the case was a haunting reminder of a life gone too soon. Decades later, a call came in to reopen the investigation. An anonymous caller said he knew something about Anna Mae's murder. He had been at a party where a female admitted to the killing. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, a rainy one, those kinds of days when even hope was gray. Detective Sarah Morgan, now in Cold Cases, listened to the voice on the other end relay its story. She bragged about it, the caller claimed, his voice shaking. Said she got away with it because no one could pin it on her. Sarah's pulse quickened as she scribbled notes. After all these years, could this finally be the break they needed? She thanked the caller and immediately began tracking down the name he provided. The detectives pulled out Zena's fingerprints from old records. Comparing those against the bloody print from Anna Mae's apartment, it proved to be a perfect match. The lab results came in more quickly than anyone had hoped. Sarah's hands were shaking as she held the report. "It's her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The decades-old fingerprint that once had been such a faint glimmer of hope finally had pointed them to the truth. The file on Zena Robertson was one of arrest after arrest and outbreaks of violence, with a consistent, underpinning pattern of manipulation. "She's been hiding in plain sight all these years," Sarah said as her determination hardened. They wasted no time in preparing the warrant. Anna Mae's family had waited long enough for answers. It would be another 26 years before Anna Mae Florence's killer would face justice. To her family, bittersweet was perhaps the overriding emotion. They had lived for decades in a state of not knowing, and now, finally, the answers they needed were forthcoming. As Zena, handcuffed now and subdued, was led away, Lily stood outside the courthouse clutching a photograph of Anna Mae. Tears streamed down her face, not from sadness, but from a sense of closure she had never thought her family would find. "We never stopped looking for you," she whispered to the photo, her voice hoarse from emotion. Detectives watched justice unfold. Their hearts were heavy, unyielding. Anna Mae's story was finally being told. The sweet delivery girl and lover of children, whose acts of goodness were no longer to be buried beneath the brutal ends of her life. She ultimately left behind a legacy of hope and unrelenting resilience. The story of Anna Mae Florence is a haunting reminder that justice, although delayed, is never out of reach. Her life, filled with kindness and love, serves as a beacon of hope for families still waiting for answers, and her case is a perfect example that no matter how much time has elapsed, persistence and hard work can bring the truth to light. So, if you or anyone you know can give even the tiniest amount of insight into a case that remains cold, please say something. It is quite literally maybe the voice which unlocks justice for another family. Share this story and let that be a fire within us all to speak when no one else has the voice to honor Anna Mae's memory. Justice delayed is not justice denied. We can make sure together that no story goes untold and no life is forgotten.